How's it going, everyone? Today we're going over the basics of match fishing on Yama River and some of the things that can help you substantially increase your bite and hookup rates, as well as the chain of priority when using 3 rods. Towards the end of the video, I'll go over some spots to increase your float fishing skill to unlock match fishing for those that aren't quite there yet. Before we get into Yama, it's important to note that to use match rods you need at least 60% in float fishing to unlock the match fishing skill. To quickly level up your float fishing, you can go to Winding Rivulet, Belaya River, Seversky Donuts River, or Ladoga Lake and try for small trophies and high bite rate spots. Since I'm sure some of you just got a match rod and are struggling to catch the fish that are biting, let's quickly go over how to set the hook before we get into the different rig components that can help you hook into fish much more consistently. When match fishing, you should use a clip on the reel and leave the bail open. When a fish bites, start shift reeling immediately while sharply turning roughly 90 degrees away from the fish to get rid of any slack in the line. Be careful not to turn too dramatically. If you turn too far, too fast, you can lose the fish, as the actual motion that sets the hook is simply reeling in the line. The point of the turn is solely to pull some slack up so that you can get line tension on the fish faster. This gets much easier with practice, so when you're just starting, I'd recommend sticking to a single pole and focusing on learning the timing of the hook set. Once you're comfortable with setting the hook, feel free to grab another rod or two. Now on to the basics. The standard match fishing clip on Yama is 35 meters with a 1.5 meter depth. This works in the majority of spots that come up on this map. I'd highly recommend not shift casting, as doing a full cast can make the float bounce back towards you, which causes extra slack in the line, making it harder to set the hook, and you may no longer be fishing in the right depth. When casting, try aiming upstream a bit to give yourself more time between having to reel in and recast your lines. However, if you want a more AFK or visually easier time fishing, you can cast straight out so that when you set your rods down, your line quickly gains tension. If your line has tension and your bail is properly open with the clip holding your line, when a fish bites, the line will quickly go slack, and at that point you can just do the normal hook set method. Now let's get into the gear setup and some things I'd recommend trying out to increase your hookup rate. Let's start with the rods. I went with 3 of the Fortuna Match M140MH rods, as they're only around 1200 silver each and have a 16.7 kilo load capacity, which is plenty strong enough for Yama. If you plan on getting higher end rods, look for skill percent rods instead of plus rig skill rods, as it has been confirmed by the devs that skill percent will always outshine the rig skills and it stacks over 100%. As far as good reels go, the Caliber HSV is perfect since it has a high retrieval speed, making it easy to quickly pull in line and set the hook. And since you use lighter leaders on Yama, there's really no reason to upgrade past HSVs for match fishing this map specifically. I would, however, recommend upgrading your HSV's drag to 17 kilo, since that will put your leaders in the low 60 to 70% range and make it so you won't burn out your reel while fighting the occasional Chinook. For your line, if you're using a leader, you'll just want to use a high capacity braided line, as some of the 5 through 10 kilo fish can pull a lot of drag and take a while to pull in. If you're not using a leader, then a 300 meter spool of 9 to 11 kg clear monoline works just fine. But using no leader does put your float at risk, so I'd personally recommend using leaders to save yourself some money on future line breaks. When you buy your wagglers, put them onto your setup and make sure they won't be too heavy. Float setups automatically add extra weight to the line, so the wagglers will have to be quite a bit smaller than you might think. I'd also highly recommend getting dedicated colors for rods 1, 2, and 3, as training yourself to mentally match a color to a specific rod can help you quickly react to bites and catch a lot more fish. Now let's get into leaders. There aren't any pike or skittish fish on Yama, so there's no real reason to use fluorocarbon leaders on this map for any kind of fishing. Because of this, it's much better to go with Snake Ultraline clear mono leaders. Mono leaders have a much smaller diameter than fluorocarbon leaders, so your bite rate will naturally be higher. Mono leaders also have a slight stretch to them, making it much easier to set the hook when match fishing. whereas fluorocarbon leaders are stiff and easily pull the hook out of the fish's mouth, causing a lot of missed bites. Feel free to do your own testing on this and try out different line strengths, but I've found that the best in my experience after testing dozens of different leader line types, lengths, and diameters is 11.2 kiloliters made from the mentioned snake line and 11.2 kg swivels. Finally, let's get on to the hooks. There are two specific hook brands I highly recommend sticking with for a much easier time hooking the fish and keeping them on. The first is the Zenith Muga size 4 hooks. These seem to have by far the most consistent hookup rates. It's worth noting here that the larger the hook you use, the lower the hookup chance is. Size 3 to 4 hooks seem to be the sweet spot between good hookup rates and general fish size. The other hooks I use and have tested are the Berserk Hooks Rage Series S1 size 3. These have a great hookup rate as well, and are specifically meant for float fishing as read in their hook description. Now let's talk a bit about sandwich bait. Sandwich bait is nice to have, but it's not necessary for good bite rates. Unlike droppers on the sea, which add more hooks to your rig, sandwich bait simply adds 2 baits onto a single hook. So rather than increasing your bite rate, think of it more as targeting a larger variety of fish with a single hook. I've noticed on Yama that the 2 baits usually just cover the different weather patterns. For example, with the current hot setup of dung beetles and grasshoppers, if you're not getting bites on the grasshoppers, swap to the dung beetles, and vice versa. It seems that the weather heavily affects the bait type that the fish are after, so don't be scared to swap your bait and test things if your bite rate slows down. Alright, now onto the big part of this guide, using a rod pod, 3 rods, and the chain of priority. I definitely recommend at least having the cheaper rod pod, as having to fumble around and set your rods down in such a fast-paced fishing style can lead you to losing more fish than you catch. And don't worry about its price, you will easily make your money back through match fishing. Now let's get into the order I prioritize while match fishing to help me catch the largest amount of fish with the lowest amount of downtime. My first priority is hooking fish, but this doesn't always mean reeling them in instantly. If you can tell the fish is large or it's pulling a lot of drag, quickly pick up your other 2 rods and close their bails so they don't end up floating a mile down the river while you're fighting the big fish. The second priority is keeping your baits out in the water drifting in the current, since you won't catch many fish once the bait action stops. This includes recasting dead lines. These are lines that have drifted for too long or are close enough to the shore to have the drifting with the current action stop. And last but not least, the third priority is reeling in the fish. You'll come to find with time match fishing that the fish don't easily come off the hook once you set your rod down, and you can often have 3 fish hooked at once with no issues. This is why I prioritize recasting the dead lines over pulling in the smaller fish, since it's much faster to reel in and recast the lines with no fish and continue getting bites. Match fishing is one of, if not the, most fast-paced fishing method in the game and is an absolute blast once you get the hang of it. This is one of those fishing methods I wish I knew about when I hit Yama, as it would have made my grind to the sea take much less time and I would have earned a lot more silver on the way. Well, that's the end of the match fishing portion of this guide. Before we get into early game float spots to raise your skill percent, I'd just like to give a quick shout out to Left for Mush. While I was trying to first figure out match fishing, he showed me the ropes, and a lot of these tricks that I shared here are directly from him and his hundreds of hours of testing and experience. So thank you, Mush. Alright, let's get into early game float fishing methods and spots. The first thing to know when raising your skill percent is that each fish has an inherent chance to give you a skill point based on the earliest map it's found in. So fish like pumpkin seed sunfish, which are only found on Seversky Donuts River, a higher level map, will have a higher skill up chance than early map fish such as bleak or dace. With this in mind, we're going to prioritize more unique fish on each map with each fishing method and spot. I don't want this guide to end up being too long, so do forgive me for rushing through these spots a bit. Starting with Winding Rivulet, this little dock by the cafe at 18 centimeter depth is a perfect place to start, as you can catch a lot of fish here with a single rod and make some decent early game silver. You can also buy a relatively cheap ultralight tele rod for the 100% EXP boost and be just fine here as the fish are all pretty small. Another spot on winding is 111, 126, using a 1.30 meter depth and redworms, as a lot of small trophies come up from this spot, and when the spot is active, you can make anywhere from 200 to 500 silver an hour with a single rod. Now let's get into Belaya. By this point, I'd recommend you being at least 30% in float fishing and swapping to a Bolognese rod, which has essentially the same hookup method as the match rod. Use a 20 meter clip with 1 meter depth and check the weekly leaderboards for which bait is active at the time. Next up is Seversky Donets River. This map is usually very active with float fishing and can net you a good amount of fish all around the map. This map is also home to a lot of unique species and the first map that a lot of different fish appear on, so the skill up chance here is great. Unfortunately, not many people frequent this map, so spot post can seem far and few between. I'd recommend simply walking around and casting out around the spots with moss or large grass, and again, check the leaderboards for active bait. The final map I'll recommend is Ladoga Lake. Here you'll be targeting smelt and all kinds of whitefish. The reason I'm not recommending places like Ladoga Archipelago or Lower Tunguska is because these maps have some pretty large fish that can randomly bite on float, and the gear entry requirement might be more of an investment than someone to put into float fishing. Alright, well, if you guys have any questions or need help with anything game related, feel free to leave your questions in the comments. And with all that said, thank you for watching. Tight lines, everyone.